This is some of the bogus misinformation circulating about NAR.
This is the first video in a series that will take a look at Dr. Michael Brown and the New Apostolic Reformation.
NAR, the so-called New Apostolic Reformation, a term that was coined by the late Dr. Peter Wagner. What is it? Is it a network with hundreds of millions of charismatics and Pentecostals around the world? Does it represent the worst abuses of the charismatic Pentecostal movement? Is it unified in any way? Does it have a joint leadership? Am I part of it? What is true? What is false? If you have concerns with what is called the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, Dr. Peter Wagner just went to be with the Lord a few days ago, and some of his staunch critics call him a false prophet, false apostle. Others look at him as a major charismatic leader and pioneer. Others have a somewhat mixed mindset viewpoint. If you have issues, we've put this online, we've posted this, so we've gotten this word out to lots and lots of people. I'd like to hear from you today. I mean, one website, it's I'm not even going to mention it online because I don't even want to, on the radio, I don't even want to draw any attention to it. But it blasts me as a New Apostolic Reformation apostle. It's like, what? Explain. When have I claimed to be an apostle? When have I been worked with Dr. Peter Wagner side by side and part of his organization? I don't even know what people are talking about. And I mean, they'll post things that are blatantly false, just false information.
Dr. Brown just said he had never worked with Dr. C. Peter Wagner. But here's what he said 6 years earlier in 2010.
Questions. This is from Debbie. Hi, I've been hearing a lot about a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, which is headed by Peter Wagner. I've heard quite a bit of controversy over it all and was wondering if you had some thoughts about it. Is it a false movement? Is it legitimate and biblical? Please let me know if you could shed some light on this. Thanks so much. Okay, I don't have a date on Debbie's email, but I think I got this one a few weeks back. Debbie, there's certainly a lot of controversy concerning what is called the New Apostolic Reformation. I have taught in the past at Peter Wagner's Leadership Institute, taught a class there on revival years ago. When have I been worked with Dr. Peter Wagner side by side and part of his organization? I don't even know what people are talking about.
I don't know him.
And I mean, they'll post things that are blatantly false, just false information. I have taught in the past at Peter Wagner's Leadership Institute, taught a class there on revival years ago. Have had some fellowship with Peter Wagner and discussed different doctrinal issues, bounced things off of one another. When have I been worked with Dr. Peter Wagner side by side and part of his organization?
I do not know this man of whom you speak.
I don't even know what people are talking about. And I mean, they'll post things that are blatantly false, just false information. I have taught in the past at Peter Wagner's Leadership Institute, taught a class there on revival years ago. Have had some fellowship with Peter Wagner and discussed different doctrinal issues, bounced things off of one another. If I've made a mistake, the whole world knows about it. Oh, man, sorry.
Dr. Michael Brown is part of the United States Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. That is the U.S. branch of the global organization, International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders. Here is the website for the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, and I'm on the page that is describing the history of this organization. Started in 1999. It's a little bit confusing because it says the idea was conceived in Singapore in 99 by several apostolic leaders, and then after the discussion, a few of the leaders, including Dr. C. Peter Wagner, gave private counsel to John P. Kelly to consider forming an international council. After speaking with other apostolic leaders, Kelly believed it was God's will for him to establish an apostolic coalition. He then organized an internal council and began inviting other apostolic leaders to join what was then called ICA. That was the original name. In 2000, at the first annual gathering, Kelly was set in as the presiding apostle, but the next year, God directed Kelly to ask Peter Wagner to accept the position of presiding apostle. And the management of this organization went to Colorado. I'm sure it was Colorado Springs. That's where C. Peter Wagner lived. So that's a little bit of the history. Wagner basically was in charge for about a decade here from 2009 until 2010. It's a little confusing because if you go to Wikipedia, it says here that he also, talking about all the things that C. Peter Wagner did in his life, this line here says that he also founded Reformation Prayer Network, International Coalition of Apostles, which is where we just were. So he wasn't the only founder, but he was one of the founders and one of the leaders of it. Okay. Now, this is the International Coalition, but there is the United States Coalition. And in the United States Coalition, they have National Council members, and that's what this page is. You can see the little logo down there. That's not the International Coalition. That's the United States Coalition. And there's different coalitions for many, many countries around the world now. But you can see right here, Dr. Michael Brown. So the organization that C. Peter Wagner was one of the founding members of has a United States branch, and Dr. Michael Brown is on the council membership for that branch.
This is some of the bogus misinformation circulating about NAR.
Now, here's the United States Coalition of Apostolic Leaders convener, Joseph Matera, talking about how they are not using the term New Apostolic Reformation to describe themselves anymore. He wants to use the term Independent Network Christianity instead.
I want to greet everybody. This is Joseph Matera, and you're here for the U.S. Coalition Roundtable. We're going to be dealing with the subject, how independent network Christianity is impacting the global church. Besides myself, I have presenters John Kelly and Buford Lipscomb. Both of them are seasoned apostolic leaders with vast influence in the international community. And we want to hear their story, we want to hear their thoughts on the development of what we're calling INC, or Independent Network Christianity. Others have termed this movement as the New Apostolic Reformation.
Actually, Joseph Matera himself was using that term until very recently. Here's a section of an article he wrote from Joseph Matera's own website, or his blog, called The Abuses and Blessings of the Contemporary Apostolic Movement. He wrote this in August of 2017. He describes himself as a person who's been part of the apostolic movement since 1989. Right here he says, for example, I've been blessed to know and work with many outstanding and legitimate apostolic leaders in the Apostolic Reformation, such as John Kelly, C. Peter Wagner, Ron Cottle, Bill Hammond, and some other people. He's served on the ICAL Council. And I wanted you to see what he says. The following are some of the blessings of recognizing apostolic leadership. Number 1, number 2. Number 3 is this. Recognizing the apostolic can help usher in a what? Yes, that's what it is. It's a new apostolic reformation. So by recognizing the apostolic thing, you can usher in the new apostolic Reformation, according to Joseph Matera in 2017.
I'm shying away from that word or that term because there are some ways of using that term in a very negative light, the way it's been categorized based on some extreme teachings and or doctrines that have been pronounced by some adherents and leaders in that group in the past decade. So for the sake of this discussion, we're going to call it Independent Network Christianity, which is more ambiguous, but more broad and has not been categorized as much in a negative light, although you always have negative lights on every movement and every thing that we attempt to do.
And on that part of the quote, New Apostolic Reformation.
We're going to call it Independent Network Christianity, which is more ambiguous,
And on that part of the quote, New Apostolic Reformation.
Dr. Brown recently did a program called Am I Part of NAR, where he clarified his positions on some things, but I don't think he did a good job of addressing the serious issues of the New Apostolic Reformation. While it's true that Dr. Brown has some differences with some NAR essential teachings, he's very close to the movement, much closer than he usually admits.
There are abuses, there are charlatans, there are problems, and as one within the movement, I've sought to address those for decades, including one whole book Whatever Happened to the Power of God, which came out in 1991, the subtitle being Is the Charismatic Church Slain in the Spirit or Down for the Count?
Seriously? He's still talking about his book from 1991? I mean, what does he have, a whole warehouse full of these things, so he has to keep bringing it up, thinking that maybe he'll sell a few more? Dr. Michael Brown endorses, promotes, and partners with some of the most extreme false teachers of the NAR. He may not be in the exact center of the inner circle, but he's pretty close. Here's what I said in an article that he tried to refute in that episode. It's on Amy Spreeman's Berean Examiner blog, but actually Amy and I wrote it together. First, you need to understand that NAR isn't an official organization, nor can it be characterized by a common creed. It is instead a loosely knit and often unaffiliated network of leaders who share a common vision and goal for the visible church. Dr. Brown often makes the claim that heresy hunters describe the NAR as a global conspiracy with people secretly working behind the scenes. But I just read to you my description that is the opposite.
All right, so let me break some things down.
Now I'm going to break it down for all of you.
All right, so let me break some things down. My understanding of New Apostolic Reformation is it is something that Peter Wagner coined as a large term describing a lot of charismatic growth around the world. However, many of those people would not have shared the same theology. They didn't share the dominionism theology. They didn't have, some of them, the apostles, prophets theology that he had. That's a name he gave. But then specifically, he led a group of people that were part of a movement that believed the same thing, that looked to him as an apostolic leader. So you could look at it as a different denomination, okay?
No, you cannot look at this as another denomination. Dr. Brown is trying really hard to distance himself from C. Peter Wagner, but it's not working. Let's look at his book. This is from 2006. This is one of the many books that Peter Wagner came out with over the course of the last couple of decades of his life. He was writing books constantly. This is all about how you could do all these great things by using this new apostolic understanding of the church. There you can see it was written in 2006. There's the contents. I just want to get to a couple of things here. First of all, you're going to see that he believes we're in what he calls the Second Apostolic Age. I don't think he explains it super well. It's a little confusing, but basically he says, we've always had apostles, but now we have apostles in an even better way than ever before. And it's taken 100 years for us to get to this point. But this is what he's observed. This is what he's given a name to. And he talks about how there was apostles, sort of, but now we really have apostles for sure now. It took about 100 years to get to where we are now. 4 notable movements of the Spirit of God have been building the foundation of the Second Apostolic Age for several decades. So he believes there's these 4 things. The African independent churches, this is one component. The second one is the Chinese house churches, that's another component. Then there's the Latin American grassroots churches, which is another component. And the one that really matters to this discussion is the U.S. Independent Charismatic Movement. As an offshoot of the Pentecostal movement, independent charismatic churches began to multiply in the United States around 1970. One of the major differences between the two was that Pentecostal churches were usually committed to democratically based church government, whereas independent charismatic churches were apostolic in nature. By the mid-1980s, the charismatic churches had become the fastest growing in America. My term for the new wineskin that God has provided for these churches is the New Apostolic Reformation. It is a reformation because we are currently witnessing the most radical change in the way of doing church since the Protestant Reformation. It is apostolic because the recognition of the gift and office of the apostle is the most radical of a whole list of changes from the old wineskin. and it is new to distinguish it from several older traditional church groups that have incorporated the term apostolic into their official name. Although it's beyond the scope of this book, he says you can look at my other book, but basically he is not starting a new denomination with its own very specific doctrine. In fact, he's saying that this is the opposite of a denomination.
So you could look at it as a different denomination, okay?
Let's take a look at another book. This is from 1997, written by Dr. Bill Hammond, who actually goes all the way back to the Latter Rain movement in the late 40s, early 1950s. He's one of the old guys that connects the Latter Rain movement to the current New Apostolic Reformation. I just want to show you that in the foreword to this book by none other than C. Peter Wagner, I think you'll see a couple of interesting things that he says. Again, this is 1997. There's the people who like the book. Sinead Jacobs was one of them. He talks about how he loves Bill Hammond. His book, Prophets and Personal Prophecy, was the only book I could find during the 1980s that, to me, made biblical and practical sense of the gift and office of the prophet in the church today. My copy is as scratched up, underlined, and dog-eared as any book in my library. I have referred to it often in my writings, and I recommend it highly to my students. Bishop Hammond's new book, Apostles, Prophets, and the Coming Moves of God, is a thrill to read. It is so timely. God has not been standing still. His purposes and works in the 1990s are not the same as they were in the 1980s. The Holy Spirit continues to speak to the churches, and Bill Hammond is one who has special spiritual ears to hear what he is saying. Just as the 1980s was a decade initiating the renewal of the biblical gift and office of prophet, the 1990s is shaping up to be the decade in which God is renewing the gift and office of the apostle. As a professional in the field of church growth, it has become obvious to me that the fastest growing cutting edge of worldwide Christianity in our times is what I like to call the New Apostolic Reformation, previously referred to by some as independent churches or non-denominational churches or post-denominational churches or grassroots churches or other kinds of names. Whatever the name, the fact of the matter is that we are seeing before our very eyes the most radical change in the way of doing Christianity since the Protestant Reformation. The changes are obvious on every continent, and there are many commonalities. As the name would imply, one of the chief features of the New Apostolic Reformation, setting apart from the more traditional versions of Christianity, is the emerging recognition of the role of apostles in the body of Christ. Because this is such a key to advancing the kingdom of God, and because the notion of contemporary apostles is so new to many of us, including myself, an urgent need of our times is wise and recognized leadership by those through whom God has been speaking and working along these lines for some time. Bill Hammond is one whom God has raised up to meet this need. Just as he helped us understand the role of the prophet a decade ago, he now helps us understand the role of the apostle today. That's from C. Peter Wagner in 1997. In a separate video, I will be explaining the connections between the New Order of the Latter Rain movement and the New Apostolic Reformation. Bill Hammond is one of the people who connects them.
I'm more practical, prophetic, and stuff. But in this vision, the Lord led me up this path. It didn't seem like I was out here watching all of this happen. And the Lord came up and he says, General Michael, this is one of my generals of the army of the saints on earth. Then it says, General Hammond, this is General Michael, the head of my army of angels. And he says, now you're going to co-labor together to accomplish my work and destroy the powers of darkness and defeat the armies of wicked spirits. Then I was out here just kind of watching, I was kind of from behind watching, and we were just talking like you and I would talk, strategizing and going there. And when you talk about it, now I'm using those strategies around the world. The greatest corporate weapon that the church has is the shout of faith. And it goes off in the spirit realm like an atomic bomb does.
Would you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Would you look in the camera and give a shout of faith? I want to see what it's like.
Oh, what to do? Okay. Hallelujah! Amen.
My goodness,
Glory.
that was a shout. What's going on in the spirit realm when you do that?
When we do that, these are what we call prophetic acts of faith. When you do it here, see, we fight. We're a natural people, but we do a spiritual warfare.
Mm-hmm. And I was never part of that, and I never agreed with much of it. So that's fact. That's simple fact. If you want to call the whole modern Pentecostal charismatic movement the New Apostolic Reformation, you might call it whatever you want.
That's what C. Peter Wagner called it. This is not what some anonymous blogger invented.
Okay, make up whatever term you want. There's no relevance to that. And use a term that he specifically coined and now use it in a way that is going to fit some other conspiratorial purpose. Forget it. That's not being ethical or honest.
Let's talk about being honest. Dr. Brown was a teacher at the Wagner Leadership Institute, yet now he claims to have no real significant connection to C. Peter Wagner at all. Here's what the Wagner Leadership Institute looked like in April of 2001. These are the teachers. Notice Michael Brown. From that same year, here are some of the classes that were available. Dr. Michael Brown was teaching one called Sustaining Revival. Here's a screenshot from 2003. You'll notice that he's still on the list, right next to all these other teachers like Mike Bickle. And then here we have 2004. He's still on the website as one of the faculty for the Wagner Leadership Institute.
Hi, I'm Cheon. In 1998, Peter Wagner, who was my professor at Fuller Seminary and my apostle, started Wagner Leadership Institute.
Notice in this picture, there's Cheon right there in the middle, and right next to him is none other than Patricia King.
The Holy Spirit spoke to me, and he said, I never want my people to be drunk on the world's wine. He said, this is the real wine of the glory. This is the wine of the kingdom. And he says, and I want you to come anytime you want and drink as much as you want. Any kind that you want. Whoa! And, how?
First of all, we're changing the name from Wagner Leadership Institute to Wagner University to learn from some of the best teachers.
The best teachers? Let's take a look. Okay, now I'm on the website for Wagner University, and you will see the core faculty, the professors. There's C. Peter Wagner, the founding chancellor, and there's Cheon, the international chancellor. He basically took over after C. Peter Wagner passed away in 2016. There's Dr. Cindy Jacobs.
Basta!
Basta, B-A-S-T-A. Come on, try it. Be
That's
a
a
little
prophetic
Latino.
swear word.
Come on, basta!
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 Basta. There's the cell phone prophet, Sean Boltz. There's Chris Vallotton, the narcissistic leader of Bethel, or one of the narcissistic leaders of Bethel. Here's Brian Simmons, the guy who has falsely translated the pretend version of the Bible called the Passion Translation, which is the worst translation of the Bible in the history of all translations. He knows nothing of how to translate the Bible, and nobody cares. There's Patricia King.
Jesus' name, the bar is open. The wine cellar is open. Just come on in and drink, 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 drink.
There's Lance Wallnau. There's Bill Johnson. There's Chuck Pierce. There's two people who I have not heard of. These are maybe people that actually have some credentials. I don't know. And then the last person is Dr. James Gall.
End Time Revival.
This is the core of the faculty. This is the core, you could say, of the New Apostolic Reformation movement as well.
And we have some of the best teachers in the kingdom of God right now to equip you in Wagner University. We've had this year alone Randy Clark, Lance Wallnau, Bill Johnson, Cindy Jacobs, and the list goes on.
Let's take a look at Cheon. This is his own website. Like a lot of these guys, he has his own personal website. He has his own church website. He has various other organizational websites. The guy has really done a lot. Whether it's good or bad is not the point I'm making. But he has done a lot. He's been around for a long time. He's also made some terrible mistakes, some horrible false prophecies. But that's for another video. H-Rock Church is his church. Harvest International Ministry is the overseeing organization that he is in charge of, a key component to the New Apostolic Reformation. There's Wagner University. But let's go to Harvest International. I want you to see who the speakers are for their upcoming conference. Look at that. There's Dr. Michael Brown right there, right next to all these other guys. The host, of course, is Cheon, Lou Engle, Cindy Jacobs, Mark Sharona, Robert Henderson, Eric Metaxas, and Michael Brown. You really can't get any closer to the very heart of the New Apostolic Reformation than this. Remember earlier in this video where Joseph Matera said that they were not using the term New Apostolic Reformation anymore and they were changing the name to Inc.? Now I want to take a couple of minutes and look at a book that was published in 2017 called The Rise of Network Christianity: How Independent Leaders Are Changing the Religious Landscape. Network Christianity, or Inc., Independent Network Christianity, is the term that these two authors used to describe the movement of the New Apostolic Reformation, for lack of a better word. I'm going to show you that they are using that term to mean the same thing. It's a really good book, and it's not a blogger operating in his basement. It's actually two scholars being published by Oxford University. They start by talking about some of the changes happening in Christianity around the world, the large denominations seeing a decline, but a growth in these independent network-style churches, which are Pentecostal or charismatic. There's a lot here. You will see the name C. Peter Wagner show up a lot. In fact, let's look at this. C. Peter Wagner, an influential writer and scholar in the charismatic world and a highly influential Inc. leader himself, has coined the term the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR, to describe many of the leaders and ministries that we are calling independent network charismatic. Some people use charismatic, some people use Christianity, but it's Inc.
We're going to call it independent network Christianity, which is more ambiguous.
So, these two scholars, published by Oxford University, are saying that the NAR and Inc. is essentially the same thing. The fastest growing WCD categories, Apostolic, Pentecostal, Apostolic, and Neo-Charismatic, include many of Wagner's NAR groups. Wagner sees these leaders and their ministries as representing a historic shift in the way Christianity is organized and practiced, so much so that he compares this shift to the Protestant Reformation. And then in his 2006 book, Apostles Today, you'll hear the same quote that I just gave you earlier. In traditional denominations, the locus of authority is ordinarily found in groups, not in individuals. That is why we are accustomed to hearing about deacon boards, boards of trustees, presbyteries, general assemblies, and so on. In the New Apostolic Reformation, however, trust has shifted from groups to individuals. On the local level, the pastor now functions as the leader of the church instead of as an employee of the church. On the translocal level, the apostle is the one who has earned the trust of the pastors and other leaders, and trust inevitably imparts authority. According to Wagner, the primary difference between a traditional denominational congregational model and the NAR model of leadership is that apostles, highly influential, dynamic individuals who exude authority and are able to bring about miracles of the Spirit, are now taking control of the governance from denominations and other administrative bureaucracies. He sees this development as wholly positive and more consistent with the biblical leadership roles of apostle and prophet. This goes completely against what Dr. Michael Brown just said about how he said that Peter Wagner was essentially starting his own denomination with a very narrow group with a very specific set of beliefs. That's not what these guys say, and that's not what the quotes from Wagner himself are saying. Let me go to another section here. I'm also a little bit concerned about violating copyright by showing too much of this book to you. This is the book that I purchased on Kindle. Here's the origins. I just want to give you a quick run-through of the origins, starting with Chuck Smith, John Wimber, and the Third Wave, which we all know, starting in roughly 1970, which is what everybody agrees to. The next thing is C. Peter Wagner and the Wagner Leadership Institute. This is a key element in this Inc. Christianity, according to the authors of this book. The next thing is Cheon and Harvest International Ministries, according to the two authors who were published by Oxford University. Cheon, the guy who is incredibly close to everybody else that we all talk about as being part of the New Apostolic Reformation, including Dr. Michael Brown. The next thing that these authors feel is a key component is Bill Johnson and Bethel. And then Mike Bickle and the International House of Prayer. Right now I'm on the International House of Prayer website, and In December 29th of 2017, you see the speaker was Dr. Michael Brown. He did a bunch of videos there over the years. So he's very close to the International House of Prayer and Mike Bickle. No surprise there.
And on that part of the quote, New Apostolic Reformation.
In summary, I think it's pretty easy to see that Dr. Michael Brown is very close to a charismatic movement that has been growing for decades now under several names, but the New Apostolic Reformation label seems as good as any. Discernment blogger heresy hunters like me did not invent this term. It came from within the movement by one of its apostles. Good discernment bloggers have been saying something to this effect all along, and even serious scholars now are describing this movement in similar terms. But Dr. Michael Brown has been changing his tune on this whole issue for about 10 years now. Although Dr. Michael Brown is a very intelligent man with some really good things to say on various issues, his treatment of the New Apostolic Reformation is confusing, contradictory, and frankly, very difficult to take seriously. This has been a Messed Up Church production. By the way, I used to listen to and actually contributed to Dr. Michael Brown. I actually listened to his programs and I appreciated a lot of what he had to say. But after a while, I started to see things that really concerned me and took me on a completely different path. So I will try to make some more videos to go into more detail about some of those things. And I hope that you found this helpful. I encourage you to look at the Messed Up Church website and YouTube channel. I also have a lot of playlists with a lot more content. I also encourage you to look at the YouTube channel and website from my good friend Chris Roseborough, Fighting for the Faith. Thanks again for watching, and God bless.
Which is more ambiguous.
So that's fact.